welcome everybody. I'm a principal consultant with Turner & Townsend, and I'll take you through this presentation. Okay, so this is just the agenda, what was being covered in the presentation. So we're basically covering scoping and specification requirements for the SHDF, Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which is wave 2.1 of the funding. This is now I think about £700 million fund for all housing associations, RSLs, council, etc., who are own and manage social housing in England. So just in terms of the agenda, obviously we've got the general SHDF programme requirements, accreditations for people involved in the SHDF process, energy targets, inputs and output-based specifications. So this is covering different approaches for specifying and then scoping the retrofit risks. So yeah, key principles, worst first. So just looking at obviously the EPC, well, D, E, F, G. So the F and G ones being your worst performing properties. Fabric first. So just basically looking at improving the fabric of the building. It's just in terms, like I say, of heat loss through walls, through drafts, through roofs and through floors, and then improving the heating system as well. Lowest regrets, as we can see there, is basically an approach which minimises the potential of measures installed needing to be replaced, or if you're doing subsequent measures, you might be then forced to remove or alter measures you've done before, which is to be avoided. That's obviously one of the key considerations of the PAS 2035. We'll come on to that in a minute. So this is covering some of the kind of underlying requirements of what SHDF is hoping to encourage within the kind of social housing area. So basically to address these kind of high level areas, fuel poverty, carbon, green economy and tenants. So trying to combine the kind of retrofit aspirations and the aims to cut across all these four themes. So in fuel poverty terms, obviously it's, you know, especially with fuel prices increasing as they have done and are due to do later this year, trying to minimise the impact of that on some of the, you know, lowest earning and poorest families in the country. So the aim obviously is to improve those properties so that they can be heated and be comfortable and healthy to live in with a reduced amount of energy to do that, and obviously reducing energy bills. Carbon savings, obviously this is one of the key underlying aims of the SHDF, and you can see there, so helping the UK meet its net zero targets. The green economy, so looking at creating opportunities in new skills, new businesses, as the UK aims to ramp up retrofit, not just through social housing, but across the whole built environment. But obviously social housing still a major area, and long-term kind of retrofit plans will give assurance to the supply chain to take on new people, to train people, to look at new skills and new job opportunities, create apprenticeships, all the other things that will happen when they know that there's a long-term campaign and funding for this kind of work. And obviously, last but not least, tenants. So looking to improve comfort, health and well-being of social tenants. Goes without saying, there's many reports which look at the impact of poor housing. Obviously, you know, just in terms of costs of heating poor housing, we've heard obviously the heat or eat dilemma that people are facing more and more, and I think obviously goes hand in hand with other issues like mold, damp, for housing is very susceptible to these issues, and we're trying to address all of these in the retrofit of social housing. So this is looking at some of the kind of compliance, the kind of competencies that we are requiring within SHDF funded projects. So you can see they're Trustmark registered. So Trustmark registration is required for PAS 2035 key people, so retrofit coordinators, assessors, evaluators, designers, etc. Those are all kind of key roles within the PAS 2035, and also for installers who need to be PAS 2030 accredited for the different measures that are being installed. They all need to be Trustmark registered. Also MCS certification is required for renewables, including air source and ground source heat pumps, which is obviously where an awful lot of the heating systems are going to be moving to away from gas and or oil, LPG, solid fuel, etc., where possible. And then the Heat Trust Consumer Protection Scheme for heat networks as well. So just thinking, also obviously in terms of COVID there, we've got the comment at the bottom there of safe working for all contractors. So we're just kind of looking at the fabric first approach, as I said earlier. So looking at primarily the built-in structure of the house. So really thinking about the walls, windows, roof and floors, or ceilings and floors. If it's a warm roof, obviously the roof structure, but if it's a cold roof, your ceiling, so insulation in a loft. And this being the kind of primary idea is to reduce that heat demand of the property and then address the heating systems and control systems and ventilation systems. So we're also expected to improve properties and space heating demand. Now this target, which was I think a hard target in the Wave 1 funding, is now more of an aspirational target. So when you're modelling, using a modelling software for how your different measures will be improving the space heating demand of different properties, then obviously with different types of properties, if you're looking at some of the very old EFG period properties, solid walls, you know, large single glazed windows, or where there might be in conservation areas or listed or whatever, and have, you know, big restrictions on certain things you can do to the property, this target might well not be achievable. So it's the idea is to make best efforts to achieve them. So just running through these kind of points here: outputs from stock modelling, SAP calculations and planning package. These are the type of outputs that you would need to be putting into your bid as evidence that you are trying to attain that 90 kilowatt hours per square metre per year target. Just on the last point there, so aiming to get properties ready for later installation. This is very much part of the PAS process. So PAS basically provides a methodology, a quality methodology for staged whole house retrofit. Basically gives you a roadmap for whole house retrofit, and then if you're funding this in different stages, the steps that you need to go through, so to avoid doing things which at a later date might need to be undone. So these things aren't going to prohibit the next stage. And obviously the final part of that equation would be you reduce the demand, put in your heating systems, and then you put in your renewable energy generation systems on there as well to aim for a low or zero carbon development at the end. Okay, so to be compliant, projects will require the services of a retrofit coordinator. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the roles that needs to be registered with Trustmark. The retrofit coordinator, briefly, is a kind of project manager for retrofit projects, and really needs to be engaged from the beginning of the project from its inception right the way through to delivery and handover back to the resident, and that retrofit coordinator will stay in touch with the resident to ensure that kind of energy bills, heating use are in line with what is expected after the retrofit work. So they're basically there to ensure that everything from the assessment and design of the retrofit, the installation, the handover, and then actually checking that it's performing properly. That's the role of the retrofit coordinator. They in turn will be ensuring that a retrofit designer, so someone qualified in that. I mean, these roles are a little bit interchangeable in the sense that someone like an architect could well be equally a retrofit advisor, a retrofit coordinator, a retrofit designer, potentially a retrofit assessor as well. But realistically, there's a kind of advantage in having these roles. Some roles, obviously, you don't want a retrofit evaluator, retrofit coordinator and designer all being the same person. Having those understandings in one role, maybe some of the very experienced retrofit architects would easily qualify in any of these roles. Is probably an advantage from the point of view of liaising with tenants, answering a lot of the difficult questions around what is involved, what exactly is trying to be achieved, etc., etc. But the whole point is that the PAS kind of has created these distinct roles to ensure that part of the process is done properly and in a consistent way. Basically giving assurance to people who are paying for this work and to the public realm that when this work is done, it's done in a way which is going to ensure that the building is going to perform as well as possible. Obviously, energy use is down to the tenant in the end, but in terms of the work that's being designed and installed, PAS is trying to ensure that qualified and competent people are doing each of these roles. That last point at the bottom there, so energy efficiency measures must be installed by PAS 2030 accredited installers. And as I mentioned before, the accreditation is for particular measures. There isn't one accreditation which covers all measures. Obviously, there's widely different skills required for the installation, different measures. So there is a kind of accreditation for different measures. And that's obviously part of the role of the retrofit coordinator to ensure that each of these installers is accredited and competent in installing that measure. So coming on to the risk assessment process, this what looks like a sort of electronic circuit diagram actually gives you a bit of a diagrammatic idea of how the risk path assessments happen within the PAS. I don't think it's necessary you need to go into this particularly, but to understand that there are different criteria which basically elevate the risk pathway of a project. So obviously, if you're just doing one measure on one building and it's not a complex measure, it's something like I was going to say loft insulation, but that needs to be done properly anyway, but it's not seen as a high risk measure, whereas something like external wall insulation is seen as a high risk measure because it needs to be well designed, technically well detailed, and it needs to be very, the installation needs to be done with a high level of competence, because a failure of EWI can be very expensive to fix, and it can be very damaging to the fabric of a building. So the idea of the risk pathway process within PAS is to really give a sort of appropriate risk category to different projects, whereby, as I say, if you're dealing with one project, one measure, which isn't a high risk measure, then all the processes which fall out of that low risk category are relevant to that sort of project. So this is something that is actually sort of appropriate to some of the other work that I've been doing with GLA on the what's called the RAHIP project, which we're working with installers to local authorities and contractors to try and deliver a energy sprung type of project. Obviously, that's very different to what we're dealing with here, but these are examples of input-based specification. So energy efficiency measures identified by stock modelling and energy efficient planning using SAP Energy Carbon or Passive House Planning Package-based modelling tool. So this is obviously for each of the housing providers, looking at the kind of different tools that you may well have and are may well using for your own kind of retrofit planning, or just using to understand your own stock in terms of where it is as an overall picture of energy efficiency, and how to manage that whole process in terms of ongoing improvement programs that you want to make sure they're as effective as possible. So Passive House Planning Package is a very, say, complex, it's a complicated tool. It's obviously designed to be used hand in hand with the Passive House process, and it is, I suppose, the Rolls Royce of these kind of energy modelling tools in that sense. Extremely accurate, lots of potential ways you can input very granular data, requires a high level of competency to use it, but yeah, it is a very, very accurate tool. So moving down here, we've obviously got EPC surveys. There's obviously a lot of talk been the reputation of EPCs. They can be wildly different in terms of their credibility. There was a lot of EPCs done at very low cost, so it's important to know that the EPCs that you've had done have been done really with very competent people, and a thorough kind of assessment procedures has been delivered. There are recommendations within EPCs for different measures in order to make the improvements. So you have a kind of provision of the rating as it is at the current and its potential after all the recommendations have been installed. So obviously that's another way of kind of understanding the potential. You could be looking at your properties in terms of just purely by EPC band. Within the bands there are obviously a range of EPC performance. Within you might be just a low EPCC or a high EPCC, but these are all different ways you can basically slice the different your property portfolio and be looking at targeting different areas, and understand also where you might have other kind of requirements or other restrictions, such as planning around listed buildings or conservation areas, for instance. So just moving on to the next slide. So this is the, as I was saying, in terms of something like Energy Sprung, this is where you would be specifying an approach to retrofit which is based upon the performance. So you're not really looking at breaking down the actual EPC categories or your space heating requirement, or your looking at one individual kind of performance criteria. Actually, you specify what you want at the beginning, and that becomes something that you're trying to achieve through a combination of measures, but you're not dictating what measures you want to go in at the beginning. So yeah, on energy, we might be looking for a performance standard that's in space heating demand. So for instance, Energy Sprung target is 40 kilowatt hours per square metre per year. By comparison, a new passive house is 15 kilowatt hours per square metre per year. And Enefit, which is a retrofit passive house standard, is 25. So Energy Sprung is sort of in the ballpark at 40, but still, not quite as demanding as the Enefit standard. You might also be looking at providing a certain amount of hot water per day per occupant, electricity provision and water use. So these are all the sort of parameters that you would be putting into something like an energy strong specification. Obviously, health and comfort of the residents, this is paramount in terms of providing homes and systems that are easy to use and that residents are able to learn with the relatively few kind of issues how to adapt to living in a home which is all about, you know, keeping the building airtight, relying on inbuilt ventilation, and using heating systems as efficiently as possible. You know, as I say, it's the people that use the energy, not the building. So, you know, best will in the world, you can have a very efficient building, but you can run it in a way which would use just as much energy as an inefficient one. So, thinking about installation time and disruption as well, occupant satisfaction with the process. That would be coming into elements such as resident engagement. So thinking about how that resident engagement strategy and process works. Some of the most successful resident retrofit projects have not necessarily gone particularly smoothly, but the resident engagement has basically been so good and well developed that actually when things go wrong, the residents don't mind, but they are willing to go along with what's happened because they're being kept in the loop, and they understand that, you know, jobs don't always go perfectly, and, you know, when they're kept in the loop and they feel that they're part of the project, not having things done to them, but they're done with them and with their involvement, then you know, the overall outcome tends to be much more positive. So you know, the word of mouth afterwards about what the process was like and what the results are like tends to be much better, and that counts for a lot when you're looking at an ongoing process and an ongoing program of retrofit. So if the first lot of residents are telling everyone how wonderful it is, then that's great. If they're telling them how awful it was, then that can be a real setback. So it's very hard to persuade the next community of people that you want to you know, target for retrofit works that everything's much better with. It's had a very damning kind of feedback from the first. So just looking there at the PAS 2035 intended outcomes. So as I was mentioning, in terms of the resident condensation, damp, mold, those are things that we're trying to address through retrofit, and PAS is absolutely geared towards looking at the movement of moisture in buildings, movement of energy through walls and roofs and floors, maintaining good internal air quality, and reducing risk to the architecture of the building. So if you're thinking about moisture ingress, interstitial condensation, which is where you get condensation trapped in a wall where the dew point is in the middle of the wall. So this is what you want to absolutely avoid. You can end up with damage to brickwork, damage to timbers that are embedded in that brickwork. And as it says, architectural heritage. Actually, if it's heritage buildings, you need to be even more careful about it, because obviously there's a lot of value put on the actual architecture as well. Its design, its kind of period of materials and aesthetics, etc. Just coming on to resident engagement, as I mentioned before, it's certainly for projects which I've been involved in where they are seen to be successful. It's been very much about the outcome for the residents at the end. If they're happy with the process, they're happy with the results, they are pleased that they got involved, they're happy to recommend it. These are all the kind of outcomes that we want to achieve. So in these bullet points, first one there, consider carefully how you will specify resident engagement requirements. So just thinking about, you know, if you're working within a registered provider organisation, at the moment you will have resident engagement activity going on which could be about all sorts of different things going on with neighbourhoods and various other kind of aspects of a community. It could be to do with upgrades, boiler upgrades, or window replacements, any kind of program. You will have had a resident engagement process for that, just to understand, you know, what the kind of on-site limitations are, when people are going to be in, who's vulnerable. Maybe some people really don't want to have anyone in their home. All sorts of different aspects, but these are things obviously that you would need to be kind of aware of and think about, and maybe engaging with certain communities which are known to be receptive. Could be, you know, an aspect to bear in mind. So well planned, well-resourced, specialist resident engagement, key to reducing delivery risks. As I said before, this is absolutely critical. Where resident engagement doesn't really get going properly, the communication isn't really well developed as a two-way process. Events where people can get together and updates can be kind of communicated, etc., etc. It's very, very important to keep people engaged in the process. So these are some of the approaches you might well take. Fully outsourced to a contractor or specialist, a resident engagement contractor. Fully in-house if you have that resource in-house with a resident liaison officer and a team, or a hybrid of the two. You might be able to use the in-house capacity, some of it, and because you're doing an additional campaign around retrofit, then there needs to be additional resource brought in. Often contractors will have this RLO capacity that they use themselves because they need to liaise with residents to gain entry to properties, to understand when people are going to be around, any kind of restrictions or limitations on access. If people are vulnerable, what other considerations to have? So there's often within contractors, they will have this role already there because it helped them deliver the work. When you're procuring contractors, it will be wise to require this within your specification for the retrofit contractors that you want to engage to do the work. Resident engagement plans should start several months before contractor is in place, because you really need to understand if there are going to be refusals from residents. You might want to understand why that is and address that. You might want to change the property selection based on that. You don't want to find that out just before the start of the project. So engagement early on, describing what it is that you're intending to do or hoping to do, and really engaging the residents in a good conversation, a two-way exchange, get their feelings, their understandings. You're putting across all the kind of aims of the project. Primarily, obviously, benefits to them will be top of their list. What energy savings they're going to be able to make is probably going to be more important to them than saving carbon. Not everybody, but it's highly likely that it will be that way around. Last 2 points there. One size fits all approach is unlikely to be successful. So it's good to basically understand the different needs and requirements of people, and be adaptable. Have something which will take account of different people's worries and what it is they would like to get out. Quite often in situations there will be resentments that might well be kind of historic towards different landlords. Sometimes residents will find or have all sorts of kind of issues about previous things. It could be to do with noise on an estate or maintenance of outside space or something else. And actually there's other kind of issues that are underlying an engagement relationship. So it's good to engage early and have conversations which start off in a kind of high level way, and really let people know that there's a channel for them to use, when they're thinking about the kind of timing of these things, the disruption, when works are likely to last. Even if works aren't being done to their property, what about the disruption of works being done to properties next door or down the street or behind or wherever? So all good stuff to kind of let people know about. And then last point there, obviously needs for vulnerable and hard to reach residents. Also key thing to be aware of as well. So there we go. Hope that was informative and helpful.